Mexico should be a failed state. This has nothing to do with the people, culture, or even the politics, but rather with a more powerful force that cannot be changed: geography. Most powerful nations have two key characteristics: a temperate climate that is favorable for agricultural production, and flat land that is easy for trade and economic expansion. Mexico is far from being temperate or flat. The north is dominated by desert, which makes agricultural and economic growth incredibly difficult. The south is a rugged jungle, which has forced much of the local population into subsistence living. If that didn't make the Mexican geography challenging enough, the nation is full of mountain chains that makes infrastructure incredibly costly. Mexico's greatest geographic asset, its coastlines, is largely mitigated by the rugged interior. Getting goods from the Gulf side to the Pacific side is not cheap, easy, or quick. If that wasn't challenging enough, Mexican rivers are terrible for navigation. The total water flow across all Mexican rivers is about 25% less than that of the Mississippi River alone. While the EU has the Rhine, and South America has the Amazon, Mexico has nothing, with the exception of the Grijalva River, which can only accommodate shallow draft vessels in certain spots. The lack of navigable rivers, paired with the mountainous interior, makes domestic trade a costly endeavor. The daunting geography not only hinders economic activity, but also political stability. Keeping Mexico united is no easy task. Shortly after gaining independence from Spain, Mexico would be rife with insurrections and rebellions. The challenging geography made it easy for Texas and the provinces of Central America to secede from the motherland. Parts of the Yucatan also seceded for several years before rejoining the fold. And when American President James Polk decided that it was time to take a few states from Mexico, the mountainous and arid geography made it difficult for Santa Anna to get troops to the front lines. 13 years later, Napoleon III decided that Mexico should be a puppet of the French Empire. But even the mighty French couldn't handle Mexico's geography. Mexican Republicans were able to remain in power in certain states and would push the French out in about 5 years. Mexico's harsh geography would make political stability and economic advancement almost impossible. It made the nation an easy target for foreign intervention. The jungles, deserts, mountains, and lack of navigable rivers would be problematic enough on their own, but all four of these features, combined within a country that is nearly 4 times the size of Spain, is a recipe for disaster. Mexico arguably has the worst geography in the world in terms of economic development and political stability. Mexico shouldn't only be a failed state, but should be in a perpetual state of chaos, similar to Afghanistan or the Congo. Despite the insane geographical challenges, Mexico is actually doing pretty good. In fact, they're doing better than good. Mexico has the 13th largest economy when accounting for purchasing power parity. This makes the Mexican economy larger than that of South Korea, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and the Netherlands. While Mexico had a very turbulent history, the country has made huge gains in the past 100 years. Mexico's explosive growth is no coincidence, and by all indications, the Mexican economy will continue to enjoy impressive gains. The likelihood of Mexico reaching economic parity with G7 nations in the coming decades is practically a certainty. Through triumphant hard work, Mexico was able to conquer its formidable geography and get on the path to economic prosperity. Here's how they did it. But first, did you know that less than 1% of the viewers of this channel are subscribers? If you enjoy the work I do, be sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date on my latest videos. Subscriber count also makes it easier for me to get replies from subject matter experts when researching videos. Your support is appreciated. When New Spain gained independence and became Mexico, the young country was perpetually restless. Mexico would be rife with coups, guerrilla insurgencies, indigenous uprisings, and constitutions with very short lifespans. From 1824 to 1884, Mexico would have 35 different heads of state. Some of these transfers of power were peaceful. Others, not so much. With this high level of political instability, Mexico would struggle to get its economy off the ground. Despite the political turmoil, Mexico became a world leader in the production of silver coins. When new silver deposits were discovered, entirely new cities would pop up to extract the precious metal. The silver would be purified with mercury and eventually make its way to Mexico City to be minted into coins. Mexico's silver coins were the preferred global currency of the colonial era. The mint in Mexico City would stamp the coins with distinct ridges, a process that was nearly impossible to counterfeit. From the colonies of Upper Canada to the Manila gallons of East Asia, Mexican silver coins could be found anywhere there is global trade. But Mexico was too good at producing silver coins. By overproducing, the coins would lose their value due to increased supply. Mexico's economy was overly reliant on silver. When silver would go through bust cycles, the Mexican economy would be hit hard. Mexico's over-reliance on silver would start to change when Porfirio Diaz rose to power in 1884. The dictator knew that Mexico had to diversify. To achieve this goal, Mexico must be interconnected by rail. Diaz improved Mexico's creditworthiness and secured loans from London bondsmen and German bankers, and quickly expanded Mexico's rail network. In 1873, Mexico only had 472 kilometers of rail, but that would explode to nearly 20,000 kilometers in just 40 years. For a country as mountainous as Mexico, building a rail network is neither cheap nor easy. But the Mexicans, along with notable help from Asian immigrants, completed the challenging task. The rapid rail expansion would also create a connection to the United States via Juarez and El Paso. By connecting with their northern neighbor, Mexico was better suited to export precious metals and import cheap cotton to boost their textile industry. However, Mexico's dependence on US cotton would not last. With rail integration, Mexico could now grow their own cotton. Durango and Coahuila would emerge as major cotton producers, and the raw cotton would be processed into textiles in Guadalajara, Puebla, and Mexico City. By 1910, Mexico was able to produce 78% of its own cotton. In the past, Mexico's economy was handcuffed to the price of silver, but with the newly built railroad, Mexico was building a more dynamic economy. The integrated economy was particularly beneficial to Monterrey, a city located about 1,000 kilometers northeast of Mexico City. Monterrey would emerge as Mexico's financial hub, full of merchants and financiers that bolstered Mexican production and exports. Monterrey would expand into even newer industries, such as steel production, glass manufacturing, and world-famous Mexican beer. With a bustling economy, Diaz decided that it was time to put Mexico on the gold standard. It was a clear signal to the world that Mexico was not just a stable country, but one full of attractive investment opportunities. While Diaz supercharged the Mexican economy, he had one major flaw that is common with dictators. He didn't want to give up power. The lack of mobility for the top leadership position, in addition to poor treatment of indigenous people, and deteriorating labor conditions in Cananea and Rio Blanco, all made Mexico ripe for revolution. The revolutionary spirit was further fueled when Diaz indicated that he would remain dictator in May 1908, despite stating the contrary only 3 months earlier. As contemporary Justo Sierra said, "There are no institutions in the Republic of Mexico. There is only a man." After 28 years of the Porfirio era, Mexico was ready for a change. The revolution commenced on November 20th, 1910, only 3 months after the country celebrated its 100-year anniversary of independence. The Mexican Revolution would last for 10 to 30 years, depending on which historical analysis you prefer. While the revolution was founded on legitimate political grievances, it nonetheless crippled Mexico's economy. In 1914, Mexico had defaulted on its foreign debt obligations. The ability to attract foreign investment was non-existent. There was a tragic amount of lost lives during the revolution. Mexico's population decreased by 1 million in a single decade. To say that the revolution hindered economic development is a cynical understatement. As the revolution progressed, Mexico was more so operated by regional chieftains, as opposed to a united country. Eventually, 2 chieftains from Sonora created what would become the Party of the Revolutionary Institution, better known as PRI, through complex political wrangling and military strong-arming. The PRI was able to make Mexico a united country again, although this was not a smooth nor peaceful transformation. The result would be a new political system, unlike any other. The PRI created a new political system that can't be easily classified. It drew inspiration from several political philosophies. The PRI could best be described as a monarchy with term limits. The president of Mexico was as powerful as a king, but had a strict 6-year term limit. When his term was approaching its end, the president would handpick his successor. An election would be held for the new incoming president, and on at least a few occasions they actually counted the votes. Instead of having nobles with fiefdoms, Mexico would have other pillars of power: big banks, big businesses, and big labor unions, all of which circulated around big government. Unlike in capitalist societies with divisions of power, Mexico's pillars of power would collude with each other. Instead of competition, these institutions chose collaboration. Labor unions were mostly for show, and businesses felt no pressure to innovate. When workers defied their union bosses and went on strike, the government would send in the army. All land and subsoil would be property of the government. While the laws of land ownership and mineral rights sounds quite communistic, it is actually more similar to a monarchy. The PRI would either manage these assets themselves, or select which business could have a monopoly. The need to adapt and improve was practically non-existent for Mexican businesses. Having friends in high places was far more important. Banks provided little help to everyday Mexicans. Most loans were only accessible to Mexico's big businesses, not small entrepreneurs. Should a Mexican want to start their own business, receiving financing from a bank was practically impossible, and expecting the government to assist in the development of small businesses was a foreign concept. Despite the neglect, many Mexican entrepreneurs moved forward with their ambitions. They would build their businesses, independent from any reporting to the banks or government. This was the birth of the informal economy in Mexico, fully functioning small businesses, operating without any bank or government services. The informal economy remains very much alive in present-day Mexico. Today, nearly 60% of all Mexican workers are employed in the informal economy. This political and economic system meant that Mexico would have a tiny middle class. Extreme income inequality was the norm. In certain years, Mexico's inequality would be quite comparable to that of apartheid South Africa. While this does sound very dystopian, it provided something that was desperately needed in Mexico: stability. The Mexican Revolution was so brutal that the people would accept just about anything for the sake of peace. For the most part, the Mexican people tolerated this new structure, sacrificing economic progress for the sake of political stability was a core component of Mexico's social contract. Mexico's elites got very, very rich in this system, but their greed was insatiable. There is one other prominent pillar of power, completely independent from the collusion scheme: the Catholic Church. When it was President Calles' turn to rule Mexico, he attempted to curb the power of the church. He rehashed communistic propaganda and added a dash of anti-Europeanism to rally the people against the church. It didn't work. Calles would enforce many anti-Catholic laws, which included restricting the freedom to worship and the persecution of European-born clergy. Perhaps the most draconian measure was using schools to indoctrinate children. The president declared, "We must enter and take possession of the mind of childhood, the mind of the youth." Mexicans across all economic classes and in nearly every state took to the streets. When that didn't work, they took up arms. These fighters became known as the Cristeros. Mexico was entering another dark chapter in its history. A very dark chapter. The Cristero Rebellion. Now, this video is about to cover some disturbing events. So much so that some of you may want to jump forward a couple of minutes. Feel free to jump forward to this time to continue the story. Mexicans could tolerate poverty, but they would not tolerate having their religious freedoms taken away. Calles would be brutally aggressive against defiant Catholics. And I do mean brutal. Many innocent worshippers and priests would join the dearly departed. This oppression only encouraged more civilians to join the Cristeros. But not all of the Cristero fighters were perfectly honorable in their quest for religious freedom. The most radical Cristeros would deliberately target public school teachers. Hundreds of teachers would become victims in this conflict. The targeted teachers became known as maestros desorejados, teachers without ears. In some cases, this was a very literal description. If a targeted teacher experienced a quick and painless departure, they would be amongst the fortunate. The most extreme Cristeros had a preference for the same techniques that were used during the Spanish Inquisition. Bishops would condemn the targeting of teachers and civilians, but controlling the extremist wing of the Cristeros wasn't an easy task. Mexico's culture war had gone hot, really hot, and everyone suffered. Despite seeing Mexico crumble before him, President Calles would not back down from his anti-Catholic crusade. His hand-picked successor would be taken out by a Cristero fighter, which created a succession crisis of its own. The message was clear. There would be no peace in Mexico without religious freedom. The official end date of the Cristero Rebellion is a matter of debate, but most agree that 250,000 people would not survive the conflict. President Cardenas is largely credited for sowing the seeds of peace. His administration restored the right to worship, and went as far as arresting Calles. Catholic bishops did their part too. They created a legion that infiltrated Cristero rebel groups, and any rebel who advocated the targeting of civilians would be expelled. Despite the progress towards peace, the conflict would have a permanent impact on Mexico's power structure. The church would forever remain an independent pillar of power, and the relationship between church and state would remain rocky for many decades. Mexico would not have diplomatic relations with the Vatican until 1992. Despite the tensions between church and state, the saints of economics were about to bless Mexico. The nation was entering a miracle. While far from being a liberal democracy, the PRI proved its value during its first international crisis, the Great Depression. While most of the world was grappling with the economic crisis, the Mexican economy proved to be more resilient. Collusion of power can have its perks. During the Depression, the PRI would send shockwaves throughout the international community. The party decided to nationalize the entire oil industry throughout Mexico. Prior to nationalization, most oil extraction was conducted by the American company Standard Oil and the British company El Aguila. The PRI would seize all of the oil-producing assets, although the companies would receive compensation for the seizure. With the newly acquired assets and nationalized oil rights, the PRI created a new state-owned oil monopoly called Petróleos Mexicanos, better known as Pemex. Nationalizing an entire industry is a risky endeavor, especially when it antagonizes the British and the Americans. In many cases, it can do more harm than good. It scares off private investment, can trigger aggressive tariffs, and tends to result in a shortage of competent business management. However, the PRI had impeccable timing. The oil industry was nationalized in 1938, on the eve of World War II. As the war unfolded, neither the US nor the UK could afford to sanction Mexican oil. The demand for oil would skyrocket during the war, and the nationalization of the liquid hydrocarbons would prove to be very profitable for Mexico. The PRI also introduced tariffs to bolster the local economy. In normal geopolitical environments, new tariffs tend to lead to trade wars, but the Anglosphere had far higher priorities than retaliating against Mexico. To keep the Mexican oil flowing, the US and the UK had no choice. If they wanted Mexican oil, then they would have to tolerate Mexican tariffs. This made Mexico a quasi-ally to the United States and the United Kingdom, and they would try to remain militarily neutral in the conflict. But Mexico's neutrality would not last. In the spring of 1942, German U-boats sank 2 Mexican oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico demanded an apology from the Germans, a demand that went unfulfilled. After receiving no response from Germany, Mexico would formally declare war on the Axis powers. This declaration would lead to the formation of the 201st Mexican Fighter Squadron, better known as the Aztec Eagles. The Eagles were based in Manila Bay in the Philippines, and were involved in nearly 800 combat sorties. After the war, the Aztec Eagles were welcomed as heroes. In the post-war economy, Mexico would adopt a very different economic strategy than most of the world. The prevailing economic theory predicted that international trade would ensure international peace. By trading for foreign goods, there would be no need to colonize or wage war for desired materials. Why go to war when every nation can get rich through trade? This economic theory would be the main inspiration for the European Union and modern globalization. Despite the new global trend, Mexico, along with most of Latin America, opted to stick with a more mercantilist strategy. In the post-war world, Mexico kept their economy isolated, with high tariffs, import quotas, and licenses that restricted imported goods. The Mexican economy would remain Mexican, regardless of what foreign economists thought. As Mexico was quite protectionist, exports would be a small sliver of the economy. Most of these exports were raw materials, such as precious metals and oil. As tariffs tend to be retaliatory, Mexican goods would be artificially expensive on the global market. Additionally, protected economies tend to produce inferior goods. Without pressure from foreign competition, Mexican goods didn't have to meet global standards to achieve domestic success. The PRI would have a very hands-on approach with domestic industries, making Mexico a mixed, corporatist economy. Big government and big business were deeply intertwined. Mexican companies could easily accept both private and government investment. Of course, government investment came with strings attached. Some of these conditions were for the benefit of the people. Other conditions reeked of corruption. Mexico would even go as far as to restrict the export of their oil. Better to keep energy prices low for domestic consumption. The isolated and mixed economy actually worked very well for Mexico. The nation would enjoy decades of impressive growth. Economists around the world were starting to dub Mexico's growth as the Mexican miracle. Little did the world know that Mexico was on the path to disaster, all due to a geopolitical crisis far, far away from North America. The world as we know it forever changed on the 6th of October, 1973. The epicenter of this dynamic change occurred over 10,000 kilometers away from Mexico. In the re-established nation of Israel, citizens were celebrating the Yom Kippur holiday, and they were suddenly attacked by Egypt and Syria. This military conflict didn't even last for 3 weeks, but its consequences are still with us today. While Israel won the conflict, the Arab and Persian world weren't too happy with the outcome, frustrated with the quick loss. These nations decided to deploy a full-on oil embargo on Israel's closest allies. The main targets of the embargo included the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the Netherlands. To prevent middlemen from bypassing the embargo, The OPEC nations also reduced oil production. Regardless of a nation's stance on the Israeli-Arab conflict, the entire world would feel the pain of OPEC's wrath.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
In the end, the OPEC nations would cut oil production by 25%. When news of OPEC's moves became public, the price of oil skyrocketed. Mexico had little to worry about during this upheaval. One of the perks of having an isolated economy is protection from geopolitical chaos. This was especially true for Mexico, given that they had plenty of domestic oil. As Pemex wasn't exporting oil at this time, Mexico was shielded from skyrocketing oil prices. But with global oil prices so high, it sure would be nice if Mexico could cash in on the situation. In a short manner of time, Mexico couldn't resist the temptation and got back in the oil export game. And since prices were so incredibly high, why not go all in on oil? To truly bolster oil exports, Mexico took on quite a bit of foreign debt to expand oil production. The oil embargo wouldn't even last a full year, but it didn't matter. The era of cheap oil would never return. OPEC made it clear that they are a legitimate cartel not to be messed with. They had no problem manipulating the price of oil for economic gains and geopolitical pressure. This was all very good news for Mexico, and the timing couldn't have been better. Mexico had just discovered an ocean of new oil reserves, particularly the Cantarell oil fields. Mexico's known oil reserves increased by 151% between 1977 and 1978, and the government took on more debt to fund more extraction. Pemex was making a ton of money in the 70s. Some of the cash windfall was used wisely, such as a significant expansion of elementary education and increasing access to medical services. Other investments were not so wise. If a private company was struggling to remain financially solvent, the Mexican government would give them an injection of cash. The PRI did a lot of this. In 1975, government investment accounted for 42% of all capital investment. But why invest in a failing business when the government could just outright buy it? That's what the PRI did, to an alarmingly high degree. Before the oil bonanza, Mexico had 391 state-owned enterprises. That number would triple in a decade. These state-owned enterprises did not need to be profitable. They could pay all of their bills with oil money. Subsidies to state-owned enterprises accounted for nearly 13% of Mexico's total GDP. The Mexican economy was artificially supported with oil profits. While this corporatist approach did protect failing companies and limit unemployment, it would not be sustainable. The policy of keeping dying businesses alive with oil profits was a very risky endeavor. If oil prices fell, Mexico would be in big trouble. Compounding the risk was Mexico's rising debts. The smart move would have used oil profits to pay off the debts that were used to build up the oil industry in the first place. But the PRI behaved in a way that assumed oil prices would never go down. Oil prices stayed mostly constant after the embargo ended, but they would surge again due to another conflict in the Middle East. The people of Iran decided that they very much don't like their Shah and decided to chase him out of the country. As Iran is a major oil producer, prices skyrocketed again. This was very good news for Mexico. But the second oil crisis would be short-lived. The oil shortage of the 70s would lead to the oil glut of the 80s. During the 1970s, Mexico wasn't the only country that had a strong reaction to the rise of oil prices. Other oil-rich, conflict-neutral nations also ramped up their oil production to cash in. The 5 embargoed nations also upped their oil and energy production. The United States started drilling in Alaska, the UK in the North Sea, and the Netherlands ramped up natural gas production in the Groningen gas fields. Canada pioneered new technologies to extract oil from the tar sands of Alberta. Japan had no fossil fuel reserves, so they made big investments in nuclear energy. Increased energy production wasn't the only reaction of the embargoed nations. They also made big strides to reduce consumption. The United States started mandating fuel efficiency standards for cars via the CAFE standard regulation, which remains in place to this day. The Netherlands made it illegal to drive on Sundays, which would be a major inspiration for present-day Dutch city design. Canada adopted a more greedy strategy. They decided to dramatically restrict their oil exports, which only worsened the crisis for their friends. The UK, which was already dealing with high inflation prior to the oil crisis, had to make more dramatic moves. Blackouts were very common in the kingdom, which forced retailers to use portable gas lamps to stay open. Industries that were heavily reliant on oil were restricted to 3-day work weeks, freeing up oil for the rest of the country. Japan was significantly more dependent on oil imports than any of the other embargoed nations. They had to make the most dramatic changes of the group. Pretty much every industry endured some type of restriction. This included limitations of Tokyo's famous neon lights and forcing bars and restaurants to close before sundown. Japan would also change their position in the Israeli-Arab conflict and realign to become more friendly to the OPEC nations. While energy travels at the speed of light, the effects of energy policy are painfully slow. No matter the energy source, new extraction and development can take years, sometimes even over a decade. In the 1970s, the entire non-OPEC world was ramping up their energy production, but the yields of these investments would not be seen for several years. In the meantime, aggressive conservation policies were being implemented to curb energy demand. When the 1980s arrived, these new energy sources were coming online in mass, and oil prices began to tumble. Oil glut had arrived, and this was very bad news for Mexico. All those investments in failing businesses by the Mexican government would come back to haunt them in dramatic fashion. With falling oil prices, Mexico struggled to keep up with their foreign debt obligations. To make matters worse, the United States was fighting inflation and raised their interest rates. This made it more difficult to acquire new debt. Given that Mexico had become overly reliant on oil exports, creditors became uneasy about granting new loans to Mexico. The Mexican economy was in a perfect storm. The decline of oil prices, poor management of a mixed economy, excessive debt, and rising interest rates all led to the 1982 economic crisis of Mexico. Banco de Mexico was running out of reserves, and the nation was on the brink of default. Mexico had little choice but to embrace privatization and neoliberalism, albeit with a Mexican twist. Many of the unprofitable enterprises would be put on the auction block. Private buyers would take over the enterprises and would have to find a way to make them profitable or join the graveyard of failed businesses that couldn't survive Darwinistic capitalism. The revenue the government gained through privatization would be used to service debts. Mexico wouldn't privatize all state-owned enterprises. They would hold on to the ones that were able to generate cash flows, specifically Pemex, telecoms, and the National Lottery. The best part about a state-owned lottery is that the government can have quite a bit of influence on who the winner is. With the combination of privatization and the reduction of corporate welfare, it seemed that Mexico might get out of their economic mess with only a few scars. But then 1986 arrived, and things got even worse for Mexico. Oil prices would completely crash. Not dip, not slide, but full-on crash. Poor Mexico. So far from God, so close to oil. Mexico was now at the point where they were struggling to make interest payments on their debt. In order to keep providing the most basic government services, Mexico had to fire up the money printing machines. Mexico was embarking on a long and painful recession that was coupled with double-digit inflation. The Mexican economy was in a complete freefall. The 80s would be a painful time for most Mexicans and would be known as the lost decade. But the hard times would lead to radical transformations. Transformations that would not only save Mexico, but forever change the North American continent. Changes that still impact our lives today.
Yo veo un México con hambre y con sed de justicia. Un México de gente agraviada por las distorsiones que imponen a la ley quienes deberían de servirla, de mujeres y hombres afligidos por abuso de las autoridades o por la arrogancia de las oficinas gubernamentales. No queremos priistas en la comodidad de la inercia, sino en el esfuerzo del cambio.
The crisis of the 80s created the ultimate stress test for Mexico's pillars of power. The government could no longer afford to keep failing businesses on life support. The powers that be had no other choice but to move towards privatization. Business leaders and workers who are on the losing end of privatization became antagonized with the PRI, Mexico's monopolistic political party. These conditions made for an interesting presidential election in 1988. For the first time in nearly 60 years, the PRI faced legitimate opposition in the form of the PAN Party and the FDN Party. The PAN was a coalition of big businesses and their workers, whereas the FDN represented a rebellious faction of former PRI members. As the PRI was very much the government up to this point, they were in charge of counting the votes, and early voting returns indicated that a PRI victory was unlikely. And wouldn't you know it, the computers used to count the votes suddenly stopped working. How strange. But this wasn't an issue for the PRI. They had no problem declaring themselves as the winners the following morning. How convenient for the PRI. But faulty computers weren't the only irregularities.
Mi abuelita todavía está votando. Mi abuelita, mi papá, bueno, todos están votando y ya murieron.
The opposition parties and the Mexican people were outraged. Not enough to spark another revolution, but pretty close. While the PRI would remain in power, they had to make democratic concessions for the sake of stability. The perfect dictatorship would have to end. The man in charge of Mexico after the fraudulent election was Carlos Salinas. And he had a very challenging to-do list. Stop inflation, solve the debt crisis, get the Mexican economy to grow again, and peacefully guide Mexico into a legitimate democracy. And just to make things more challenging for Salinas, there was an indigenous rebellion in the state of Chiapas, although that rebellion was pacified by mostly diplomatic means. Mostly. While Salinas had monumental challenges before him, he did have one crucial advantage, a strictly enforced term limit. Regardless of his popularity, or lack thereof, the Mexican Constitution prohibits presidents from serving multiple terms. In many democracies, politicians tend to be too focused on seeking re-election instead of providing good governance. This would not be a concern for Salinas, or any other modern Mexican president for that matter. Mexican presidents serve for 6 years, not a day longer or shorter. This structuring allows presidents to make tough decisions that may result in short-term pain, but provide substantial long-term benefits. This would be great for Mexico, because Salinas had to make tremendous changes that would be quite painful in the short term. The first order of business was inflation. Most of Mexico's inflation was due to good old-fashioned money printing. Sounds easy enough to fix, but not really. Mexico wasn't printing money just for the fun of it. They were doing it to keep the government functioning. Should the money printing stop, then the government would become insolvent, and an even greater crisis would ensue. But Salinas had a plan, and he put his Harvard degrees to work. His first step was to renegotiate debt, to slow down the bleeding of cash. Salinas went hand in hand to George H.W. Bush, London bankers, and the International Monetary Fund. These foreign financiers were happy to help Mexico, so long as they made some sacrifices at the altar of neoliberalism. Debt restructuring came with the mandate of privatization. Many of Mexico's remaining state-owned enterprises would have to be put on the auction block for non-government bidders.
Nosotros privatizamos los bancos, la compañía telefónica, las líneas aéreas, la siderurgia, las minas. Estamos ahora procediendo a privatizar los puertos, los aeropuertos. No hay modelos. En México lo que nos ha funcionado es un sistema de privatización a través de subasta pública.
Privatization was part of Salinas' plan from the beginning. Some of Mexico's biggest enterprises would be sold to private owners. The most notable example being Telmex, which was the entire telecom industry in Mexico. Telmex fetched an impressive price of $3.53 billion US. When adjusted for inflation to today's money, that's a lot of pesos. And unlike his predecessors in the 70s, Salinas made smart moves with this influx of cash. First, he shut off the money printing machines. Due to the funds from privatization, the government could now pay its own bills. There is no need to keep printing money, and there is plenty of cash left over to make massive payments on Mexico's outstanding debts. Both inflation and debt rates dramatically decreased during privatization. While privatization was well managed by Salinas, it is not without criticism. Certain deals had the stench of corruption, particularly the Telmex deal. The telecom was purchased for $3.5 billion, despite only having assets valued at $1.3 billion. Given their projected revenues, and that all state-owned enterprises are inherently inefficient, something didn't seem quite right with the very high markup. Where there's smoke, there's probably fire. And that was the case for the Telmex deal. The new private owners of Telmex essentially bought a monopoly, and they gouged prices for consumers. After the acquisition, they raised rates by nearly 250%. As it would take time for other telecom competitors to emerge, Mexicans had no other alternatives during the price gouging. The shady behavior created Mexico's first billionaire, in Carlos Slim, and he would hold the title of the richest person in the world for a few years. Similar corruption accusations can be found in other privatization deals. Banks were sold for 3 times their book value, with the promise that there would be no foreign competition for 15 years. Televisa, which accounted for 90% of Mexican television viewership, was protected from competition for 12 years. Salinas would face accusations of turning Mexico from a mixed economy into an oligarchy, but the expiration dates on the protectionist clauses made all the difference. Yes, the private buyers would enjoy monopoly-like advantages, but just like the Mexican presidency, the monopolies came with a strictly enforced term limit. Salinas invited foreign investors to partake in privatization, which also hedged against the risk of oligarchy. In total, 126 foreign investors would be involved in privatization, notably the British company Unilever, which bought big swaths of Mexico's food processing industry. Allowing foreign investment into the Mexican economy raised some populist eyebrows. But with the taming of inflation, Salinas enjoyed impressive approval ratings during privatization. During the privatization bonanza, Mexico's most sacred state-owned enterprise would not be sold. Pemex remains a state-owned monopoly to this day. Salinas saved Mexico from collapse, but his to-do list was unfinished. Now it was time to build up the Mexican economy. Taking inspiration from the economic boom of globalization, Salinas decided it was time to get Mexico into the business of free trade. Mexico was poised to do very well as an export-based economy, assuming the president could broker a free trade agreement. He first reached out to the rich nations of Europe, and the Europeans said no. Spain and Portugal had just joined the EU in 1986, and the Iberians would provide cheap labor for the richer European countries. The EU also planned expanding eastward, as the Berlin Wall had just fallen. When Spain and Portugal started demanding higher wages, the EU would then rely on the Slavs for cheap labor. Europe simply didn't need Mexico, and would much rather employ fellow Europeans. But Mexico shouldn't feel insulted by Europe. It's not personal, it's geopolitics. For Mexico to tap into globalization's wealth creation, they would have to go north. While this made a lot of geographic and logistical sense, it would be a monumental political challenge on both sides of the border. Mexicans have a love-hate relationship with their northern neighbor. On the citizen level, there's a lot of love. As for the PRI's attitude towards the United States government, that's where most of the hate comes from. Some of this is rooted in legitimate historical grievances, and other distrust stems from anti-US propaganda during the oil glut crisis of the 80s. If the people were getting too restless, the PRI could just blame all of Mexico's problems on the gringos. Having a government-owned television monopoly has its perks. The 80s were ripe with anti-US propaganda and conspiracy theories that made Mexicans uneasy about getting into bed with Uncle Sam. Salinas had some persuading to do.
This was a tremendous change in the way Mexico dealt with its mighty neighbor to the north. Because in the past, in the 19th century, when some people tried to build the railroad between the border at Laredo and Mexico City, there was a Mexican president who said, "We have had so many bad moments in the relationship that instead of the railroads, I prefer the sand of the desert to be between Mexico and the US." And later on, another Mexican president said, "Of the difficulty of this relationship, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the US." This was the type of mentalities that we had to change. By the way, when I told these reflections to a friend of mine, the governor of the Bank of Israel, Michael Bruno, he said, "Mr. President, it's very peculiar because here in Israel we say the reverse." And I asked, "What do you mean?" "Yes, we say, poor Israel, so close to God and so far from the US." But nevertheless, it's a matter of geopolitical realities, and ours is the one we were facing and the one we were trying to change.
But lucky for Salinas, he had sky-high approval ratings at this time. If he told the people that they could now trust the gringos, the people would trust him.
I believe in a strategic alliance between government, entrepreneurs, and workers in order to compete in a global economy that we are going to face.
Persuading the Americans to make a free trade agreement would be a bit more challenging. Should the US agree to free trade with Mexico, their already suffering manufacturing sector would be gutted. The only way to compete with cheap foreign labor is with tariffs. Whichever political party opened free trade with Mexico was bound to face criticism from the opposition party. This meant that Salinas had to persuade both American parties for free trade to last. Again, he put his Harvard degrees to work. He explained to his US counterparts that America's best days were behind them. Unless they acted quickly, The East Asian tigers were rising and could easily replace America's economic dominance. And that wasn't the only threat to American economic superiority. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the EU was poised to expand eastward. The EU was destined to become an economic superpower, one that could easily surpass the United States. But the US could keep the title of world's biggest economy without antagonizing their allies. All they had to do was open up to free trade with Mexico. Mexico could provide cheap labor for American businesses, allowing them to remain competitive with Europe and East Asia. It was a simple proposition for the Americans. Work with Mexico and prosper, or slowly fall behind Europe and East Asia. Salinas had no problem getting support from the Republican Party. After all, Ronald Reagan had advocated for a North American Union since at least 1979.
We live on a continent whose 3 countries possess the assets to make it the strongest, most prosperous, and self-sufficient area on Earth. Within the borders of this North American continent are the food, resources, technology, and undeveloped territory which, properly managed, could dramatically improve the quality of life of all its inhabitants. And so a developing closeness among Canada, Mexico, and the United States, a North American accord, would permit achievement of that potential in each country beyond that which I believe any of us, strong as we are, could accomplish in the presence or the absence, I should say, of such cooperation.
The Democrat Party needed a bit more persuading due to their political alliance with the labor unions and the working class. But Salinas worked his magic and was able to persuade the donkeys. However, both parties would have to do their own persuading to try to get the American people on board.
The peace and friendship that we've long enjoyed as neighbors will now be strengthened by the explosion of growth and trade let loose by the combined energies of our 360 million citizens trading freely across our borders.
We make the best tires in the world, but we have a hard time selling them in Mexico because they have a 20% tax collected at the border on all of the tires that we try to sell. Now, when they make tires and sell them into the United States, the tax at the border is 0. So it's a one-way street. NAFTA changes that.
Salinas made one small error in his calculation of US politics. Every now and then, a third-party candidate can rise to power. Meet Ross Perot, a billionaire who got fed up with America's duopoly of political power and decided to run for president. And this Texan wasn't too keen on free trade with Mexico.
We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
When the election arrived, Perot received about 19% of the popular vote. Not enough to get to the White House, but still a very impressive turnout for a third-party candidate. While Perot ran on many issues, his hostility towards free trade with Mexico was a major cornerstone, an issue which remains politically relevant to this day. But this would not be Salinas' problem. He had successfully persuaded America's 2 major parties, and free trade with the United States was a done deal. Salinas never intended to include Canada into the free trade agreement, but the milkbaggers forced themselves in anyways. The US and Canada already had a free trade deal, and Canada was afraid they would eventually get dumped for Mexico. As the Canadian economy is highly reliant on trade with the US, they could not risk getting left out of the deal. Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney had a pretty good relationship with George H.W. Bush, and had no problem securing Canada's access to the deal. And with that, the North American Free Trade Agreement was born. NAFTA was a bit of a compromise for Salinas. as he had much grander free trade ambitions. It is speculated that he wanted to go as far as to create a union that would be comparable to the EU. This Union of the Americas would not only include the three amigos, but also Costa Rica, Chile, Venezuela, and Colombia. But Salinas' ambition would not be politically viable. He would instead have to sign individual bilateral trade agreements with the non-NAFTA nations. In any case, Salinas was on a winning streak. Not only had he saved Mexico, but he put his country on the path to prosperity. The Mexican economy was revived, and the lost decade was replaced with well-founded optimism. Despite these mammoth achievements, his to-do list remained unfinished. He still had to guide Mexico into a democracy. Here's where things get strange. Many democracies emerged from the ashes of a military conflict. The US had to fight the British, and Germany and Japan had to be leveled to the ground before democracy arrived. Mexico's transformation into democracy would be more peaceful, but not perfectly peaceful. Salinas had to determine where the PRI ended and the Mexican government began. Up to this point, the PRI and the government were one and the same. The president had to enforce hard boundaries that infuriated the old guard of the PRI. In order for Mexico to win, the PRI had to lose, and politicians hate losing. Salinas and his more democratic allies created new electoral agencies. These agencies were nonpartisan and would verify the legitimacy of future elections. New election rules were put into place, notably voter ID laws and multi-party election observers. In some elections, foreign observers were involved to ensure democratic legitimacy. The democratization of Mexico would arrive suddenly. In the 1989 gubernatorial race of Baja California, a member of the PAN party won the election. For the first time in nearly 60 years, someone outside of the PRI would lead a Mexican state. Salinas congratulated the opposition governor on his victory. This was a great sign that democracy was taking hold in Mexico. But the old guard of the PRI was not amused.
Con la dirección de un partido inepto, es imposible conquistar el poder. Nuestro no es un partido inepto. El nuestro es un partido en lucha. No es ni siquiera un partido en crisis.
O se cree apasionadamente en el partido, o no se es priista.
Y si algunos quieren el poder, que no lo quiten si pueden.
But Salinas remained firm. Mexico was now a democracy, and the old guard at the PRI would have to accept that. By opening the door to democracy, Salinas made a lot of enemies within his own party, and the president wasn't done. Despite moving Mexico towards democracy, Salinas continued the practice of choosing his successor to lead the PRI. In normal times, Victor Camacho would have been the obvious choice. Camacho had various cabinet positions and was close friends with Salinas. But these were not normal times for Mexico. Instead of following with party tradition, Salinas chose Luis Colosio. Colosio was a longtime member of the PRI, but was firmly planted in the Democratic wing of the party, and he wasn't afraid to condemn the more corrupt elements of his own party.
Yo veo un México con hambre y con sed de justicia. Un México de gente agraviada por las distorsiones que imponen a la ley. Sabemos que el origen de muchos de nuestros males se encuentra en una excesiva concentración del poder.
Selecting Colosio to inherit the PRI was the smart move to ensure democracy in Mexico. Should the PRI win the 1994 election, Colosio would undoubtedly keep Mexican democracy intact. But Colosio would never see the election results. While campaigning in Tijuana, Colosio's life would come to a sudden end. The candidate was taken out by a lone shooter.
El señor licenciado Luis Donaldo Colosio, candidato del Partido Revolucionario Institucional a la presidencia de la República, ha fallecido.
Theories of who truly dispatched Colosio remain a hotly debated topic in Mexico. He had made plenty of enemies within the PRI, and it is only natural to speculate that the old guard of the party was behind the plot. The shooter was identified as Mario Martinez, and he was clearly mentally disturbed. His personal journal revealed that he believed that he was sent by Aztec spirits to take out Colosio. But that was an unsatisfactory explanation for many Mexicans, including Colosio's widow. She believed that greater forces were at play in her husband's death. Colosio's father has similar suspicions. Speculations of foul play were further fueled when another high-ranking PRI member was taken out. This time, it was Jose Ruiz Maciel, a close political ally of Salinas, and also his brother-in-law. Maciel's death only fueled the speculation of who is behind the murder of Colosio. It seemed that the anti-democratic wing of the PRI was eliminating their enemies. The death of Colosio is quite analogous to that of JFK. Both men embodied the spirit of optimism, and both were taken out in plain daylight. Many people in both countries are unsatisfied with the official explanation. Decades after the fact, both of these incidents are hotly debated. No matter who is truly responsible, Salinas had little time to mourn the loss of his would-be successor. He still had a country to run. To replace Colosio in the upcoming election, Salinas selected his campaign manager, Ernesto Zedillo. After the appointment, Salinas would have to return his attention to the economy. With the recent political instability, Salinas needed to reassure the world that Mexico was still open for business. As Mexico was now an export-based economy, devaluing the peso would bolster both foreign investment and exports. Peso devaluation would reassure the world that Mexico was in fact ready for globalization. While Salinas was strategizing on how to best devalue the peso, Mexico was having a presidential election. For the first time in history, Mexico's presidential debates would be televised. 34 million people eagerly tuned in.
Yo estoy aquí porque miles de hombres y mujeres libres de Acción Nacional votaron con libertad por esta candidatura. Y usted, con el debido respeto, quiero decirle que está aquí como consecuencia de dos tragedias. Por una parte, la muerte de Colosio, y por otra, la designación presidencial. La primera lo rebasa, no tiene usted ninguna culpa, pero la segunda lo descalifica, por lo menos si hablamos de democracia.
En primer lugar, y muy respetuosamente, yo le pediría a los señores candidatos que no lucren políticamente con el asesinato de Luis Donaldo Colosio.
On election day, 77% of eligible voters went to the polls, and they chose to keep the PRI in power. But this time around, there would be no legitimate accusations of election fraud. The PRI won fair and square, and the opposition parties conceded. This was great news for Salinas. He could easily work with his soon-to-be successor to create a cohesive plan to devalue the peso. To greatly oversimplify, Mexico retooled some of their debt instruments to weaken the peso. And the plan worked, but far too well. On a single day, the peso lost about 14% of its value, and over the coming months, the peso would lose another 50%. This was far more than what was originally intended. A new financial crisis was unfolding, the tequila crisis. But this crisis would be much shorter-lived than the oil glut crisis. Mexico's northern neighbor was doing very well financially, and was able to create a rescue package for Mexico. The United States was happy to loan Mexico money to help stabilize the peso.
In Washington today, President Clinton said that the economic crisis in Mexico is far too severe and its impact on the U.S. far too important to wait for Congress to make up its mind. And so Mr. Clinton has acted on his own to shore up Mexico's currency, the peso.
I'll be sending a letter to the president this afternoon along with Gingrich and Eshel and Gephardt, in effect supporting the president's position, so he won't be out there by himself.
Dole and other congressional leaders like this new Clinton plan because of what it does do and what it does not do. It does help rescue Mexico from a financial collapse they believe could have shaken the U.S. economy. But it does not force Congress to vote on what looks suspiciously to the U.S. public like a $40 billion taxpayer-financed bailout. Britt Hume, ABC News, the White House.
The bailout ensured that the very painful tequila crisis would be short-lived. Instead of experiencing another lost decade, Mexico would only have to suffer a lost year. The tequila crisis unfolded in the early days of the Zedillo administration. As politicians tend to do, Zedillo tried to blame the whole crisis on his predecessor. This is where Salinas made his biggest political mistake. The smart move would have been to remain quiet and let the tequila crisis fade away from the public's memory, but Salinas let his ego get in the way of being smart. He would fire back at Zedillo in interviews, and Zedillo returned the criticism. The attacks between the two former allies would continue for far longer than necessary. Few quarrels are more petty than politicians with wounded egos. And that was the case for the Salinas-Zedillo feud. The Mexican people were ready to move on from the tequila crisis, but the politicians could not stop playing the blame game. In time, Zedillo decided to hit Salinas where it really hurt. He went after the former president's brother. Raul Salinas had a lot of money, a suspiciously large amount of money, and it was mostly stored in Swiss bank accounts. Zedillo would have the brother arrested on money laundering charges, making it public of how wealthy Salinas' brother had become. The Swiss banks complied with Zedillo's investigation and froze all of Raul's cash. It's never a good sign if your money's too dirty for a Swiss bank. President Salinas had always had the stench of corruption around him, and his brother's dealings were too much for the public to tolerate. The hero of Mexico had lived long enough to become a villain, and his reputation would never recover. The former president was afraid that he would face his own corruption charges, and he fled Mexico for Ireland. His self-imposed exile would only further degrade his reputation amongst the public. Innocent people don't run away, and Salinas had just ran 8,000 kilometers to a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with Mexico. The optics were very bad. When the dust settled, Salinas would return to Mexico many years later. He would attempt to rehabilitate his image by appearing in numerous documentaries, but the former president had his work cut out for him. A 2012 Excelsior survey found that most Mexicans have a very low opinion of Salinas. Of all the former presidents evaluated in the survey, Salinas ranked dead last. 65% of the respondents declared that Salinas was the most corrupt president on the list, and a further 64% blamed him for the tequila crisis. While Salinas does deserve a good amount of criticism, the hate he receives is a bit too much. Yes, there are some very serious concerns about corruption, but at the same time, Salinas saved Mexico from the lost decade, and he laid the foundations for democracy. He is a complex man that cannot be categorized as purely good nor purely evil. No matter your opinions on Salinas, it can't be denied that he forever changed the North American continent. Changes that would bring prosperity to all three amigos. and enhance cultural pollination across borders. Salinas may have had the greatest impact on North America than any other individual in history. Sure, there are plenty of figures that influenced Canadian-US history and US-Mexican history, but as for who had the greatest influence on all of North America, I think that honor belongs to Carlos Salinas. I challenge all history buffs to prove me wrong in the comments section. Just don't be a jerk about it. I got feelings too. In any case, we have yet to see the full effect of the Salinas legacy. Due to Salinas' creation of NAFTA, Mexico will replace China and Germany this decade, and both the US and Canada will eagerly make that happen. But that is a topic for another video. US politician Ross Perot predicted that NAFTA would create a giant sucking sound of US jobs going south. While correct, Perot failed to see that the giant sucking sound would flow in every direction imaginable, and even suck in jobs from Europe and Asia. Yes, it is true that a lot of US jobs and investment went south, but a lot of Mexican investment also went north. Take, for example, Rossini, one of the biggest brake manufacturers in the world. A majority of North American pickups use parts manufactured by this Mexican-based company. While officially headquartered in the state of Coahuila, Rossini built two main manufacturing hubs in Michigan and Ohio, all thanks to NAFTA. Rossini isn't unique. There are several other Mexican-based companies that also expanded manufacturing in the north. Vitro, which makes car windows, is headquartered near Monterrey, and they built 6 manufacturing hubs in the US, and 4 customer service centers in Canada. There is also Nemak, a key supplier of engine heads and blocks. Also headquartered near Monterrey, Nemak expanded their manufacturing into the US and Canada. These are not anecdotal examples. Car manufacturing across the continent is deeply integrated in all 3 countries. Today, there is no such thing as a Canadian car, a US car, nor a Mexican car. There is only a North American car. Instead of trading with each other, the 3 amigos build together. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a legitimate fear that North American manufacturing would be crushed by Asian competition. But thanks to NAFTA, those fears were mitigated. Today, the United States exports about 1.6 million cars per year, and they were built with components from both Mexico and Canada. This high volume of exports would be impossible without NAFTA. North American car manufacturing became so efficient that Asia and Europe were concerned that they couldn't keep up. As a result, foreign car companies had no choice but to invest in North America. The result is an undeniable win for the entire continent. And this map is just for final assembly. A map that included all parts manufacturing would be too cluttered to be coherent. NAFTA created a trilateral automobile manufacturing superpower. Through commercial integration, the 3 amigos build products that are highly competitive on the global market. Today, nearly 5 million US jobs are dependent on NAFTA. Of course, Mexico won too. Since the implementation of NAFTA, Mexican GDP per capita has grown by nearly 54%. And Mexico's income inequality also improved after the implementation of NAFTA. Mexico's contribution to the North American economy goes well beyond cheap labor. Mexico also provides a lot of brain power. Starting in 1996, Mexico made big investments into training their own engineers. In some years, Mexico had more engineering graduates than either of its northern neighbors. This investment greatly expanded the Mexican middle class, while also attracting additional foreign investment. When GE wanted to develop new technology in renewable energy, they set up shop in Mexico. When Honeywell wanted to make advancements in new safety features, They too went to Mexico. And when Boeing wanted to crash test a 727, they did it in Mexico. Mexico's crown jewel of engineering is arguably the Volkswagen Jetta A6. About 70% of all the parts on this popular sedan were designed by Mexican engineers. In total, nearly 900 Mexican engineers made this car possible, and the vehicles were assembled in Puebla. During peak production, Mexico built 2,500 Jettas per day, 80% of which were exported around the world, including Germany. But the Jetta A6 is unique. Most other North American manufactured goods are built and designed by all three amigos. If someone in the US buys a product that was imported from Mexico, there's a 40% chance that it contains at least one component that was made in the US. If they buy a Chinese product, that probability drops to 4%. While the automotive sector is highly integrated, it's not the only one. Aerospace, large vehicles, iron steel production, household goods, and clothing are all deeply integrated across all three countries. There is no doubt that NAFTA supercharged the North American economy, but the trilateral economy needs much more than just capital, engineers, and factories. It also needs cheap and reliable energy. When it comes to fossil fuel energy, all three amigos are big producers of natural gas and oil. Both Canada and the US rank in the top 5 of natural gas production. Mexico also fares well, ranking in the top 30. As for oil production, all three amigos rank in the top 15. When it comes to energy, a perfectly united and integrated North America would be completely energy independent. But the three federations are a bit hesitant of becoming too reliant on each other. After all, export diversification is the safe move. Canada ships about 4% of its oil outside of the continent, and Mexico exports nearly 50%. The US does the same with natural gas, exporting about 54% outside of North America. But should globalization completely collapse, as I speculated on in another video, North America is one of the few places in the world that can maintain modern living standards. If the three amigos want to pursue a low-carbon economy, they can also do that, all on their own. If any country is serious about going green, they'll need to do it with nuclear energy. Canada just so happens to have the world's biggest uranium mine. The McArthur River mine alone accounts for 13% of the world's uranium supply. Of course, modern nuclear facilities need to utilize high-end microchips. And high-end microchips need high-purity quartz. The most productive mine for high-purity quartz can be found in the Spruce Mining District of North Carolina. Only Norway has access to similar reserves of high-grade quartz. Russia does as well, but they're going to have a hard time importing the needed mining equipment for the foreseeable future. As for actually manufacturing the high-end chips, that's where Mexico comes in. Maybe. Those deals are still under negotiation at the time of this recording. Should it go through, Intel already has a world-class research and design center in Guadalajara, and there is plenty of Mexican talent that can make chip manufacturing a reality. Chips or no chips, all three amigos have access to another critical resource needed for the future, lithium. And this is just a satellite view of the new North America. On a more granular level, cities along the US-Mexican border were radically transformed due to NAFTA. Neighboring cities aren't isolated, but more so operate as integrated metropolitan hubs, quite analogous to how Buda and Pest merged into a single city. San Diego relies on the Tijuana airport for international flights. El Paso, La Cruces, and Juarez are often referred to as the Borderplex, and it just so happens to be the home of the first commercial spaceport in the world. And who can forget the aptly named towns of Calexico and Mexicali? But to truly understand the integration of these binational metro hubs, I recommend the Histories of Mexico podcast. While researching this script, I came across the Histories of Mexico podcast and was truly impressed at the level of deep research and engaging presentation style. I reached out to the podcast, and they were kind enough to critique the scripts for this video series. The podcast is full of entertaining stories, from the indigenous peoples of Tabasco to the Chinatown of Mexicali, known as Chanisca. The podcast is profiling the history and geography of all 32 Mexican states, and I can't wait to see where this podcast goes. And they are releasing a special supplemental series that documents the integration of the US-Mexican border cities. The podcast is linked below. Be sure to check them out after this. Now, back to NAFTA. NAFTA enhanced the economies of all three countries and made them more resilient to geopolitical shockwaves. NAFTA has been so successful that Ross Perot's son and heir now sings its praises.
So you look at how important trade is for us, it's huge. NAFTA is critical to our economy. I mean, Mexico is part of the Texas family. I mean, the men and women of Mexico are critical. The men and women coming in from Mexico to help run our economy are critical.
For all of NAFTA's benefits, it did have one critical weakness. None of the beneficiaries of the trade agreement took the time to promote its impressive yields. Politicians on either side of the border would eagerly highlight NAFTA's flaws to erect populist excitement. Over the years, it seemed that NAFTA could withstand populism, but then the 2010s arrived. While NAFTA did a lot of good for the continent, it did cause a lot of damage to specific groups in each country. These pain points cannot be ignored. In the US, manufacturing jobs plummeted. This includes both factory workers and mechanical engineers. Some of this job loss can be attributed to advancements in robotics and the rise of China. The actual number of jobs lost due to NAFTA depends on which analysis you prefer. As for Mexico, small and medium-sized corn farmers were on the losing end of the trade deal. While the US heavily campaigns for neoliberalism and free trade, there is a bit of hypocrisy that needs exposing. The agriculture sector, for reasons that can be traced back to the Dust Bowl and the New Deal, the US government loves protecting their farm industry. This includes a mix of subsidies and protectionist tariffs, all of which vary from crop to crop. Just as Mexico refused to liberalize their oil industry, the US refused to liberalize the ag sector. This meant that Mexican corn farmers got crushed when NAFTA arrived. They were not competing on a level playing field, and small Mexican corn farmers had no chance of competing with US corn farmers that were heavily subsidized with government handouts. However, not every Mexican farmer suffered. Those who converted their crop production to avocados tomatoes, or strawberries, did very well. So well that Mexico has a trade surplus in the ag sector. Identifying which Canadians lost from NAFTA is a bit more nuanced. Generally speaking, if a Canadian industry or company was already integrated into exports, they did very well. But if a firm was too dependent on Canadian-only customers, they would suffer. It is undeniable that NAFTA was for the greater good of the continent, but it is equally undeniable that it caused a tremendous amount of suffering to a minority of the population. These weren't job losses, these were career losses. The wheels of economic progress tend to crush over the innocent, whose only crime is choosing the wrong career at the wrong time. The legitimate grievances against NAFTA created an environment ripe for political opportunism and sensationalist journalism, particularly in Mexico and the United States. Any US politician who wanted to become president would have to criticize the trade deal.
Instead of creating jobs, NAFTA cost us jobs.
NAFTA was a mistake.
Which Democrat opposed NAFTA and other trade deals that send American jobs overseas? John Edwards is the only one.
I'm John Edwards, and I approve this message.
I want to be a president who focuses on smart, pro-American trade.
Well, there's no doubt that NAFTA needs to be amended.
But one presidential candidate sounded a bit more sincere in his criticisms of NAFTA.
NAFTA is a disaster.
The single worst trade ever made by any country anywhere in the world.
Secretary of State, and I have
Your husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, you go anywhere you want, Secretary Clinton, and you will see devastation where manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country.
But Trump wasn't the only trade skeptic nativist to rise to power. Meet Andre Manuel Lopez Obrador, commonly referred to as AMLO. In a lot of ways, AMLO is a mix of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. He is highly suspicious of foreigners, rails against neoliberal capitalism and free trade, is anti-tax, pro-welfare, and is quite critical of his next-door neighbor. AMLO first ran for president in 2006 and lost by a very slim margin. He never conceded and held a large protest in the Capitol.
Les propongo que aquí nos quedemos, que permanezcamos aquí día y noche, hasta que se cuenten los votos y tengamos un presidente electo con la legalidad mínima que nos merecemos los mexicanos.
After the protests, AMLO created a new political party, which eventually won him the presidency in 2018. When he took office, he maintained Mexico's very tough anti-immigration policy, so much so that he received criticism from Amnesty International.
President Andrés López Obrador have been continuing with this narrative about humane policies towards migrants and refugees. Unfortunately, in practice, we are seeing totally distant from that narrative, from that discourse. The militarization of the borders, the continuation of these shared policies that are violating the rights of people, the treatment that many of these people are receiving at the border, including the border between Mexico and Guatemala. Amnesty International has been documented massive deportation of people in need of international protection, including Haitians, Central Americans, Venezuelans, Cubans. People have been detained in immigration detention facilities.
With nativism rising to power in both Mexico and the US, it seemed that NAFTA was done for. But while both presidents talked tough on NAFTA, they knew that a full-blown repeal would be catastrophic to their economies. North America had become deeply integrated, and a sudden halt to that integration would trigger a recession, if not a full-blown depression. To put it simply, none of the three amigos can build a car on their own anymore. Sure, new supply chains can be established to resurrect domestic car production, but these new supply chains would cost billions of dollars and take years, if not over a decade, to completely develop. And all of that investment from Europe and Asia would evaporate. During the spring of 2022, North American automakers faced a chip shortage, and car prices skyrocketed. And that was for just one component needed to build a new car. If similar supply chain stresses were put on brake pads, windshields, airbags, steering wheels, or any of the thousands of other components needed to build a car, it would have been a disaster. And that goes without mentioning the steel, plastic, rubber, and other materials needed to build the components in the first place. If NAFTA was killed, then the North American economy would be killed with it. North Americans would be left begging Cubans to teach them how to maintain old cars. This dilemma extends well beyond the automotive sector. Any industry that is plugged into the $10.6 trillion of North American trade was at risk. The economies of all three amigos had become quite reliant on each other. Terminating the deal without a replacement would utterly kneecap the North American economy. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed when it became very likely that AMLO would be the next Mexican president. He made 2 phone calls, one to Trump and one to the sitting Mexican president, Enrique Peña Nieto. He informed the 2 presidents that they needed to renegotiate NAFTA now. If they could complete the deal before AMLO took office, he promised that he wouldn't kill the deal. In the spring of 2017, the new NAFTA negotiations began. While Trump and Nieto certainly had an awkward relationship, the trade negotiations actually went pretty smooth. There was too much at stake for political shenanigans. The US and Mexican trade negotiators agreed to make slight adjustments to the original deal that were mutually beneficial, and both presidents included their respective opposition parties to ensure that the new deal would be politically viable, despite all the preceding name-calling and awkward photo ops. The negotiations were quite productive. Everything was progressing nicely. But then the Canadians got involved. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau thought that he could use the NAFTA renegotiations as a way to win political points with his environmental base. He had already strong-armed Alberta and Saskatchewan, and now he thought he could do the same thing to Mexico and the United States. Quite a bold move, considering that Canada has higher per capita CO2 emissions than either of its southern neighbors. Despite the hypocrisy, Trudeau was serious. He would not agree to a new deal unless there were stronger environmental clauses. To be fair to the Prime Minister, it could be argued if environmental protections would make for good policy, but it cannot be argued if they were politically viable. Getting Mexico and the United States to agree to environmental guidelines wasn't going to happen. Trump's political base included the fossil fuel sector, and he wasn't going to stab them in the back, especially for Canada. As for Mexico, there's a patriotic connection with their oil. In Mexico, the people own the oil, not corporations, and certainly not foreigners. They would never sacrifice that asset for any foreigner, AMLO has been very clear about his stance on Mexican oil throughout his career.
Quitan el petróleo. Sería como desangrar a México.
But Trudeau insisted, and insisted, and insisted he would not back down.
But I've also said very clearly, and Canadians know this of me, that I will stand up for Canadian interests. I will only sign a deal that is good for Canada, and no NAFTA is better than a bad deal, and we've made that very clear with the President.
Right now, in very intense negotiations, I would say, would be the word intense with Canada. We'll see how it works out. If it doesn't work out, that's going to be fine for the country, for our country. It won't be fine for Canada.
America doesn't need trade with the rest of the world nearly as much as the rest of the world needs America for trade.
How much does Canada need the U.S.?
Since day one, we have needed them incontrovertibly. And that's uncomfortable for many Canadians because we sort of have the junior partner sensation. But the truth is that all of our infrastructure largely points north-south, that all the various pockets of population around the country trade more with the Americans than they do with each other. BC trades more heavily with Washington State than it does with Ontario. Ontario certainly trades more with the Midwest than it does with the Atlantic or Pacific coast. Most of Alberta and Saskatchewan's trade goes south as well. So we pretty much desperately need them.
By a certain point, the Canadian Conservative Party was starting to get very concerned that Trudeau's negotiation tactics would backfire.
We're seeing a relationship, a key relationship with the U.S., which we should be building on the good relationship that we have. And again, Trudeau has known, certainly we all understand that Trump can be who Trump is, but the Prime Minister sure didn't help the situation. Well, we have a very respectful and grateful relationship that we have with our U.S. counterparts, and we certainly wouldn't have gone in and started to lecture on things like gender rights and the environment.
The Canadian Conservatives were right to worry, as the Mexicans and Americans were growing exhausted with Trudeau's stubbornness. After all, they were working with a deadline. They had to get the deal done before AMLO took office. The Mexicans and Americans decided to have conversations without any Canadians present. There, they asked themselves something that we've all wondered at some point. Is Canada really that important? Wouldn't it be easier to just make a deal without Canada? And that's exactly what Mexico and the US did. And they were very sly about it. Sure, it would have been preferable to keep all three amigos intact, but Trudeau's stubbornness put the entire deal at risk. The Mexicans and Americans had no other choice. It was time to send Canada packing. And as both Mexicans and Americans have an appreciation for the dramatic arts, they decided to break the news to Canada in a very exciting way. Instead of privately informing Canada that they were getting kicked out, Mexico and the US decided to surprise Canada with their expulsion on stage at the end of a press conference, which led to this perfectly timed photo. This was very bad news for Canada. About 29% of Canada's GDP is based on exports to Mexico and the United States. Being expelled from NAFTA would be much more than a mild inconvenience for Canadians. But the Canadians did have an ace up their sleeve. This is Chrystia Freeland. She is very much the hyper-intelligent yin to Trudeau's incompetent yang. She speaks 7 languages, has degrees from both Harvard and Oxford, received prestigious awards, and she did all of this without being the son of a former prime minister. If anyone could save Canada, it would be Freeland, and she had very little time to work with. In a matter of a few sleepless days, Freeland was able to get Canada back into the trade agreement. She severely reduced Trudeau's environmental mandates, and as a cost for re-entry, she had to open the Canadian dairy market to American farmers. But that's a small price to pay to avoid an utter economic catastrophe. At long last, the people of Ontario can finally enjoy the first world luxury of properly packaged milk. With Freeland's brilliance, Canada was saved, and the three amigos remained intact. The new NAFTA would have to be ratified by each country's legislature. This would be an easy process for both Mexico and the United States. Since opposition parties were consulted during the negotiations, there was little political drama. As Canada has a Westminster-style democracy, the opposition party wasn't too involved in the negotiations. The exclusion would not have an impact on the deal's ratification, but it did lead to a drama-filled week in Ottawa.
One of the good things about having a drama teacher as Prime Minister is that it's very entertaining. Our Prime Minister has been acting like he's standing up to Donald Trump, when in reality, he's just backed down.
Mr. Speaker, there's a bit of a mystery here, because last week, I think the Conservatives were urging us to capitulate. They were urging us to do it.
Order. Well, it's funny that they would choose to use the word capitulate, because capitulate is precisely what they have done. They have capitulated on pharmaceuticals, allowing Trump to force higher drug costs on Canadian patients to boost American drug company profits. The question is, what did they get in return for all of this capitulation? Did they get an end to Buy America? Yes or no?
The Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives seem to have discovered a lot of Monday morning courage, having counseled throughout this negotiation.
Well, she can misrepresent our position all she wants, so I'm trying to find out the position of this government. We know that they've backed down to Donald Trump by capping future growth of Canadian auto exports.
This deal is great for the car sector. It is great for the car parts sector.
Mr. Speaker, it's funny, the Liberals are trying to take credit for things we already had for 25 years.
Thanks, Conservative!
You know, they're trying to take credit for something that was negotiated under a previous Conservative government. We know what they sacrificed, what they gave up in backing down to Donald Trump. Higher drug costs for Canadian consumers and higher profits for American companies. We know they gave up a lot for Donald Trump, but what about on softwood lumber? Tariffs have killed jobs in the forestry industry in Canada for a long time. Have they finally put an end to Trump's tariffs on softwood lumber? Yes or no?
Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what we got for the softwood lumber industry. It's something called Chapter 19. This dispute settlement mechanism is absolutely essential for our industry, and
Order. Alarm. Alarm.
Despite the fireworks and political posturing, Canada ratified the agreement. Each country has their own name for the new agreement, but I'm just going to keep calling it NAFTA for simplicity's sake. With the new NAFTA finalized and ratified, a celebration was in order. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and key advisor, was bestowed the Orden de la Águila Azteca. This is the highest honor a foreign civilian can receive. After AMLO officially took the office of the presidency, Trump invited him to the White House for their own celebration.
The relationship between the United States and Mexico has never been closer than it is right now. We're cherished friends, partners, and neighbors. Our cooperation is founded on mutual trust and mutual respect between the two of us and between our two countries. And we honor the great dignity of both nations. Today we celebrate the historic victory we achieved together just days ago when NAFTA was officially terminated and replaced with a brand new, beautiful USMCA.
This was quite the political feat. Trump was elected on an anti-Mexican campaign, and AMLO was elected on an anti-US campaign. Yet the two nativists achieved a historical high point for US-Mexican relations. Politics is the art of the possible. Trudeau wasn't invited to the celebrations, and Freeland's dedication to Canada hasn't received enough praise. She did more for her country in 6 days than most of us could do with 6 lifetimes. For all of Trudeau's faults, he does recognize talent when he sees it. Freeland would receive a series of much-deserved promotions. At the time of this recording, she is currently the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. She may very well be the next Prime Minister of Canada. As for the new NAFTA, it really wasn't all that revolutionary from the original. There are updates to intellectual property laws, new rules for e-commerce, and a $16 an hour minimum wage for all auto workers, no matter which side of the border they were working. But there is one detail in the trade agreement that went largely unreported by the media. At the time, it seemed to be not very newsworthy, but this little detail put Mexico on the path to greatness. The United States is the world's largest consumer market, and the modern American shopper is quite different than just a decade ago. In the past, American shoppers only cared about 2 things when shopping: price and quality. But the majority of Americans have a new metric: ethics. 56% of Americans refuse to buy from companies that they consider unethical. This figure is much higher amongst millennials and Gen Z. Hopefully, Americans will expand this thinking to beyond just companies, and also consider where their products come from. Because when it comes to an ethical comparison between the Chinese Communist Party and Mexico, there's no comparison at all. The CCP ruthlessly steals intellectual property. Mexico has over 14,000 patent applications every year. The CCP brutally oppresses religious minorities. Mexico is building the Train Maya, which is expected to lift 1 million indigenous people out of poverty. The CCP is building secret police stations across Europe. Mexico entered a free trade agreement with the EU in the year 2000. The CCP is using TikTok to gather intelligence on the youth of the world. Mexico developed Sky Alert, the premier app for earthquake warnings. The CCP is the world's largest polluter. Mexico has over 8,000 square kilometers of protected state parks, all of which play a critical role in protecting the North American biosphere. The CCP is responsible for over 55% of oceanic plastic pollution. Mexico created the Riva-Hajedo Archipelago National Park, a nearly 14,000 square kilometer conservation area designed for the purpose to protect migratory marine life. The CCP seized Tibet and Hong Kong. Mexico hasn't annexed any land since 1897. The CCP is increasingly threatening Taiwan. Mexico has no imperial ambitions whatsoever. No matter which social justice issue is most important to you, it doesn't matter. Mexico is morally superior to the CCP in any category you can possibly imagine. When shoppers vote with their wallet, they should vote for Mexico at every possible opportunity. When you see a product with the prestigious Made in Mexico seal, you can buy with confidence that the product was in fact made in Mexico. Chapter 4 of the new NAFTA agreements significantly raised the rules of origin standards. The days of making slight alterations to change a product's origin are over. With the new NAFTA, Made in Mexico means Made in Mexico. But not all of us vote with our wallet. If you care more about money than impressing your hipster friends, Mexico is still the superior option to China. While there are variances across industries, the Mexican workforce is cheaper, more productive, and more talented than China. Labor rates in Mexico are about $3.95 an hour, versus $4.50 an hour in China. And the lower cost doesn't mean lower quality. Mexico has been in the manufacturing sector for more than 60 years, and this tradition has created multi-generational talent. While China makes inferior products of dubious quality, Mexicans take pride in their craft. As the Mexican economy grows, so will wages. But this won't cause Mexico to lose its competitive edge. When Mexican wages become more expensive than China's, Mexico will maintain its cost competitive advantage. This is in large part due to their northern neighbor. Mexico gets about 76% of its natural gas from the United States. And it's dirt cheap, all thanks to the shale oil revolution. Depending on the year, natural gas prices in China are around 50 to 170% more expensive than that of Mexico. Of course, there's a tremendous shipping cost savings when buying from Mexico. In 2018, a 53-foot shipping container from China to Los Angeles would cost about $5,000. That same shipping container only costs $600 if coming from Tijuana. The close proximity also allows Mexican companies to offer far superior lead times. When working with a Mexican supplier, US and Canadian clients can expect a 1 to 2 day lead time. When working with a company in China, lead times can exceed 3 weeks. Mexico has minimal geopolitical risk. Trump may have started the trade war with China, but boy oh boy has Biden escalated that war. One of the few things that America's two political parties can agree on is that the CCP is evil. But even if the world didn't hate the CCP, the Chinese have one major flaw that can't be fixed: population collapse. Anytime a nation industrializes, they can expect to see a decline in birth rates. And the CCP decided to kick that into overdrive by implementing a one-child policy. Reliable data about China is always a challenge, but most sources would agree that China has had below replacement birth rates for around 30 years. In April of 2023, India surpassed China as the most populous nation. Combine China's low birth rates with the CCP's hatred for immigrants, and the Chinese have a declining population on their hands. The CCP has officially acknowledged that their population shrunk by nearly 850,000 people in 2022. If that's the official number provided by the Communist Party, it's fair to assume that actual numbers are much worse. China's demographics are not good. With an increasing elderly population and a declining working age population, China's dependency ratio should frighten investors and economists. If current trends hold, 25% of China's population will be over the age of 64 before the end of the decade. And with China's low GDP per capita of about 12,500 USD, the CCP is going to have a very difficult time supporting their senior population. Any company that remains in China is going to face a labor shortage, and the possibility of higher taxes and political unrest. One way or another, China's status as the world's factory will not survive this decade. Demographics are not a problem for Mexico. In fact, Mexico has one of the healthiest demographies in the industrialized world. Mexico will likely face population challenges around mid-century, but that's not a concern at the moment. For the next few decades, Mexico is ripe for economic development. While Mexico is well positioned to replace China, they are already replacing another economic giant: Germany. Germany's demographics are a lot worse than China's, and there is a good chance that the German population has already peaked. Germany's industrial sophistication and might simply can't be maintained with this demography. But I have good news for the Germans. Unlike China, Germany got rich before they got old. The German economy will have much more financial resources as it deals with population collapse. Additionally, Germany's situation is very similar to Japan's. They're both medium to ultra high-end manufacturing exporters, dealing with the shrinking population. And Japan's population crisis is more advanced than that of Germany. Germany can see what has or hasn't worked for Japan and adapt as needed. But Germany's biggest strength is Mexico. The German-Mexican partnership goes way back. When Volkswagen was looking to set up shop in the Western Hemisphere, they chose Puebla to be their new home. In 1967, they opened a new factory that manufactured the iconic Beetle, which took America by storm. And the German-Mexican partnership has grown ever since. Today there are nearly 2,000 German companies that have operations in Mexico. Some of Germany's most recognizable brands already have operations in the Aztec nation. Despite the terrible 2020s, German investment in Mexico has expanded. Between a collapsing population and energy insecurity, Germany needs to offshore now, not soon, not in the next few years, but right now. German executives and economists know this, and that's why they're investing heavily in Mexico. This isn't theoretical, it's happening in front of our eyes. In 2022, Mexico saw an increase of direct foreign investment of 25%, and a lot of that cash is coming from Germany. The question isn't, will Mexico replace German manufacturing? The real question is, how long will it take to build the new factories? And German companies aren't the only ones pumping money into Mexico. Flex Americas, Molex, and Mazda all have multi-million-dollar investment plans for Mexico. All global supply chain readjustments point to Mexico. The US and Canada want to nearshore their supply chains to get away from China, but they don't have the demographics to build domestically. The Northern Amigos won't be able to nearshore without Mexico. Germany and Northeast Asia don't have the population to maintain their manufacturing industry. To save their economies, they also need Mexico. To put it bluntly, the world needs Mexico. And Mexico is just about to complete the Isthmus project, which will operate as a second Panama Canal, albeit with sophisticated ports and high-speed rail, as opposed to a solid waterway. Between the nearshoring of manufacturing, the tech sector of Guadalajara, and the mega project on the Isthmus, Mexico is on the cusp of an economic explosion. Kind of. Of the many highly talented Mexican analysts that I sourced in researching this video, I know exactly what they'd say. I am overhyping Mexico's future a bit too much. And that's very valid criticism. Mexico's middle class is likely to grow, and wages of all classes are likely to grow too. But this growth won't happen overnight. All the new factories being built in Mexico will take at least a few years to complete. Just as there is no get-rich-quick schemes with personal finance, the same applies to national economies. Most Mexicans watching this video will probably earn more money than their parents, and the children being born in Mexico today will probably earn even more. But this doesn't mean everyone gets a coastal hacienda with a yacht. Instead, more Mexicans will be able to enter the middle class and enjoy comfortable lifestyles. Will Mexico be considered a first world country in the very near future? I think that's highly likely. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out this one. A big thank you to the patrons who help finance this channel. Another big thank you to the Histories of Mexico podcast. Don't forget to check them out now.